and welcome to the Podcast Brunch Club podcast. My name is Adela, and I'm the founder of PBC. As you probably already know by now, PBC is like book club, but for podcasts. Every month, we put together a thematic podcast playlist, and groups worldwide gather to discuss them. So the theme for our December playlist was Talking About My Generation, and it featured 4 episodes. You can find the full playlist at podcastbrunchclub.com/generations. One of the episodes that we featured was from Multistory, and I'm really excited to have Becca Bryers, the host of the show, as our guest today. So in 2019, Multistory won Best Radio Podcast at the British Podcast Awards. And Becca is also the chapter leader of our PBC chapter in the East Midlands in the UK. Welcome to the PBC podcast, Becca. So happy to have you here.
I'm happy to be here.
So why don't we start with you giving us kind of the big picture overview of what Multistory is about?
So Multistory is a storytelling podcast. Each episode has a different theme to it. I've done 3 series of it. There was supposed to be a 4th series this year, but coronavirus has put everything on hold. But basically, it's stories from across England. So I work for BBC Local Radio, which has 40... I say that hesitantly because sometimes they say 41. I don't quite know how we gain or lose a station, but we have around 40 stations across England and the Channel Islands. Each one kind of broadcasting to a set local area for local people about local issues. And I have worked for local radio for a number of years, and I just thought, there's so many great stories that come out in a particular area that could be relevant to other people, just because, I live in the city of Leicester, there could be an amazing story here that has real universal appeal, and it doesn't matter that, you don't have to live in Leicester to appreciate that. So why not get it on a bigger platform? Because you'd only ever hear that story if you lived in this area and could pick it up on your car radio or whatever. So that was a kind of starting point for it. And so the idea is every episode, there's probably usually 4 stories, all collected on a theme. And they could be from, I think the oldest story I featured might be 5 years old. And then some of them have literally been broadcast. So you can actually dig stuff out of the archive as well. And I take stories that largely have originally been on a radio station. Some of them are also original stories. And I kind of reversion them.
Okay.
So typically the stories, it might have been 2 people in a studio doing an interview, and there's a particular way of storytelling on radio, which is great and really suits radio, but sometimes it's quite upfront and it tells you what the story is about right from the start. Whereas I think storytelling in podcast, because you always listen from the beginning of a story, you can play with the narrative a bit. So, I might twist it and re-edit it so there's not a big reveal at the beginning. I add in music and my own narration. So it's quite fun. And each episode I try to make slightly different. But that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's kind of taking stories that are already out there and bringing them to a wider audience.
I'm thinking about how much work that must be, because the BBC must have a huge archive of stories and local stories. How do you, it just seems like a huge piece of work. Is that the case?
Yeah. So it's the most challenging thing is actually finding the stories, surprisingly, because they're there. I always say I could fill shows just with one station across one week because they're constantly doing these incredible stories of people. But really kind of getting the ones that really stand out. And, there's not a system that allows you to just search for them. We do have systems across the BBC, but sometimes you don't. The special element is just by talking to people. So I've kind of built up a network of producers and editors at the different stations who I can get into contact with. I send out emails. I often send out prompts. So I'll sometimes think, I might get a couple of stories in that might make me think, hey, I'll do one on generations.
Yeah.
But I need a couple more. So then I'll email the stations have you got any kind of stories on this? Stories you can't get out your head is often how I describe it. Or stories where you think, oh, I wonder what happened to those people.
Yeah.
Because, sometimes I'll go and revisit the stories. I'll always get in touch with the original contributors anyway, just to make sure they're happy with their story going out in a different format than they expected. But yeah, it's a huge job. And if I'd worked out a proper system, because I listen to so much that never makes it to the podcast as well. There's just a huge amount of listening.
Right.
It would be an impossible task to listen to everything that came out of the station. I think you'd never get to the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost like thinking about it in the same way as like curating a Podcast Brunch Club playlist. It's like, sometimes I have an idea, and I've gotten this feedback a lot about curating a playlist for PBC, is that it's like really a lot more difficult than I think people are anticipating, because even if they have the idea for the theme, and I don't know if that's the way that you start as well, if maybe you have an idea for a theme, usually for Podcast Brunch Club, it comes up because somebody listens to an episode and they're like, oh, this would be a really good episode to talk about. So I'm going to take a step back and call it, this would fit in great with a theme about, grief or whatever. And then they go out and seek 3 more episodes that would fit in the grief category, right? On a playlist. And that's where they always run into the problems. They find that first one that they want to talk about, and then it's going out and trying to like cull the entire universe of podcasts out there for the right fit that goes with that first one, then the third one that goes with the first and the second one. And it's so hard. So I can't imagine. I mean, it seems like almost the same sort of task for you, but in years and years of archives of local stories. So
yeah, it is. And I actually went quite old school in doing it. I mean, because I've not been making it recently, they've all gone, but the walls in the room I'm in at the moment were just covered with Post-it notes, because I'd find a story that I loved, I'd write it on a bit of paper, stick it to the wall, and then I'd start trying to group them together. Yeah. And there's certain stories that would move an entire category, because I was always, I'm always trying to look for not the obvious,
right,
like categories and themes that you're not just expecting the same thing for every thing. And comparing that to Podcast Brunch Club too, I think the playlists that really work are ones where it's one theme but different angles. Whereas sometimes you can get months where they're quite similar, which is also interesting, but there's always, I think, more to talk about, more to think about when you're getting things from multiple angles. So it's quite challenging, it's quite fun, but it is the most time-consuming part and the most frustrating part of it, because the stories are out there, but you can't quite get them.
Right. Or like you're like, oh, this story has to exist out there, and you're just looking for it. And maybe you find something that's almost the right fit, but not quite doesn't have the exact hook you wanted. But do you work on it by yourself?
Yeah, so multi-story. So recently I've been working on a different podcast, which has been I've had a little bit more help, but multi-story was pretty much on my own. That's not completely true, because I should say that I couldn't make it without the hundreds of journalists across local radio.
Right.
Because, some of them are my original stories, but a lot of them have been found by other people, recorded by other people, followed up by other people. So in that sense, I'm just working with their material. But in terms of the actual podcast production, then I had an editor who'd listen to my stuff and be a good sounding board to bounce stuff off. But we're not exactly high in resources in local radio. So writing it, editing it, putting the music in.
Choosing the stories that go in is all on you.
Yeah. And again, I bounce it off my editor sometimes and talk it through, because I'm someone who has to talk through what I'm thinking. But yeah, and I was never supposed to present it either. So I was never supposed to be the host. So when I created the pilot, I was looking for the right host, and I kind of think I had 2 weeks until I had to deliver it, and then suddenly it turned to 2 days, and then I had to deliver. So I just said, well, I'll record it, but obviously just imagine someone else presenting, and then it stuck.
So was that because what was the reason that you didn't want to be the voice behind it?
I guess because I wasn't super confident doing it. I mean, I've worked as a radio producer, I've worked in audio for 15 years now, and I'd worked in live radio production, and I'd presented in the past, but only in emergency situations when a presenter was ill, or I'd done a few documentaries, but I didn't see myself as a presenter. I just didn't think, I thought they'd want someone a bit more shiny and a bit more experienced to do it. But actually it's been really great for me. And it's funny listening back, because I think I can see that my presentation has improved over time, and it sounded a bit awkward in the view, particularly because I was trying to sound natural. I was trying to like take on board everything I'd heard Ira Glass say about how he learned to speak naturally. But I think it has been good for me to do. And I suppose it gives a different texture because what you find in the UK is often if you ask brilliant journalists to voice something for you, they're so trained to speak in a particular BBC newsreader style, they find it very difficult to speak in a different way. And I'm sure there's equivalents in different countries. So actually, perhaps the fact that I've always been an awful newsreader, that kind of played to the podcast, I hope. I mean, I can't really say, like, that's for other people to judge, but yeah, it kind of turned out to be a happy accident in the end.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's awesome. I think that, sometimes it's important to kind of push yourself out of your comfort zone and just try something. And I also think that, it's totally natural to look back on maybe your, initial stuff and think like, oh, but I think it's really also important that you put it out there. Cause I always tell people if you're thinking of starting something or if you're thinking of trying something, I mean, come up with a plan for sure. I'm not saying go in blind, but don't think that you're going to get it perfect at the beginning. Like, know that you're going to mess up in the beginning and be okay with that, because that's the only way you're going to get it to where it needs to be, because you're going to figure it out as you go and be able to kind of tweak it as you go. But you have to be willing to put stuff out there that is maybe substandard in your mind,
Yeah, absolutely. That's completely right. And I think what was quite good with local radio, because in a way, Multistory was one of the first podcasts they did. They took on board what I'd said, that, like a lot of podcasts, they take months to get this following. And I think what's really interesting, and actually anyone who's listening is thinking of making a podcast who's, completely independent, isn't in the industry, it's almost better for you in a way, because it's quite a lot of pressure if you work for a massive broadcaster that has this, expectation of level of quality. If you don't pick up, listeners quickly, or it doesn't sound that great, that seems really bad. Whereas actually some of the best podcasts that are out there are stuff that people have played around for a couple of years, they've found their voice, it's a bit more low risk, and they're just really passionate, and that comes across in it. And I think sometimes, from lots of big broadcasters or media outlets, they almost get it wrong because the passion isn't there, and also it gets cut too quickly before you've built an audience, because it's just ratings are important. I suppose the nice thing about the BBC being a public broadcaster is sometimes there's a little bit more leniency, because it's not necessarily completely about a revenue return immediately.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think what I hear you saying is that, like, in some situations, failure is kind of not an option, or it's not an option, but it's much more risky to fail. Whereas if you don't have kind of that, if you're not at that level, it's actually really not a huge risk. Like, when I started Podcast Brunch Club, if I had messed up, who cares? Nobody's really watching me at that point. But with you as sort of being already in it and like having this big organization around you, there's more eyes on you in terms of like success and failure. So yeah, there is a nice benefit to being a little bit more anonymous when you start something.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And also there's this thing of like, well, it's my career, and if I can't get this right, then what can I get right? I should say, by the way, the revenue thing is wrong, because actually there's a lot of pressure on the BBC, because we're spending like British license fee payers money. So it's all about being seen for value for money. But
yeah. It's always about money. Everything's about money. Okay, so let's take a step back. Like, tell me a little bit about yourself. We learned a little bit that you've been working in radio for 15 years. Like, part of this is that I also, we're talking to you because we featured your podcast on the playlist, but we're also like, we have the added benefit that you're also a member of Podcast Brunch Club, a member of the global community. So like, I want to use this as an opportunity for people to get to know some of the other members in the community. So like, tell us about yourself. You were where were you born and raised? Did you want to do this, as a little girl? Like, did you study this?
Go for it. I was born in Leicester, where I live now. And then I grew up, which is in the middle of England. In the East Midlands, is like in the region, and that's the chapter I run of Podcast Brunch Club. So I grew up in Leicestershire. I've very much stayed in this area. And you know what? I was really into like arts and theatre and reading as a kid. And so that's kind of what inspired me. I think I thought I'd be a film director or a theatre director. So when I left school, I decided to go to university and study English, and I purposely chose a course that had a bit of theatre in it. But I never wanted to be the actor. I'd always take the role of being a director, which is interesting because that's kind of what a producer is in a way. You're keeping everything going on radio. And then it just so happened that the BBC were running a scheme for young people, for like 14 to 18-year-olds over that summer before I went to university, which was work experience. And it was, you could be an arts reporter on their local website. Oh. And I thought, well, that's cool because I'll get in free to see gigs and stuff. So I applied purely on that basis. And I very nearly forgot to hand in the application. And I always think back to this because I just think, how would I have got in otherwise? But I did. I sent it in and had an interview and I got in. So I spent the summer before university getting to go to all these amazing things and going to music festivals and just writing about them. And then I kind of never left. So throughout university, I went to the University of Nottingham, which is also in the East Midlands, and is kind of like a triangle of where I was living, working at Radio Leicester, and going to University of Nottingham. And I just did that triangle for like 3 years. And I just answer phone calls at the weekends or early morning shifts. I mean, it was like the coolest part-time job ever. And then I just kind of stuck, and I just left university, started working more hours, and gradually found my way in until I was a full producer on radio. So I kind of stuck doing that, and I've done various other jobs for the BBC, kind of training, and, I stepped into management for a little while. But then I got really into podcasts, and it was through a friend, my friend Chris. He kept going on at me, have you had this podcast called This American Life? And I was like, even though I worked in audio, I was like, I don't really know what podcasts are, and no. Finally, I listened and absolutely then got obsessed, and then started consuming all of these podcasts. And, it was all the American podcasts that, that were big, because the BBC, they got on to podcasting early, but largely they would just, I suppose this is what This American Life is. It's just a radio show originally that was put into podcast form. But America just seems so far ahead of what we were doing in the UK. And then I kind of started a petition to local radio. So, we have the whole BBC and we are just one part of it. And we tend to broadcast traditionally to kind of an older audience and a local audience. But I just thought, kind of modeled on This American Life, so much about This American Life is, these tiny stories that happen in this town I have never heard of in America. And sometimes with concepts that don't even make sense to me in the UK, because there's, there is cultural difference. And yet I really care about it. And I was like, we have so many of those around England. Why are we not doing that? And that was kind of my starting point for essentially a campaign I started with management at local radio, that we should do something. And Multi-Story was the result of that.
So how long have you been doing Multi-Story?
That's a good question. I think it was 2000. Oh gosh, I don't even know. 2000.
It was after you started Podcast Brunch Club there, because I remember when you launched. It was probably about a year after you started.
Yeah, so maybe 2018, I think. So yeah, I think I did 2 series in 2018, and then, or was it 2018? Yeah, and then I did 2 series in 2019, and then I was supposed to do the 4th series now.
So this petition that you started to kind of get the BBC on the podcast train, when was that? Was that around the same time or shortly before, or was that like way early?
It took quite a while. Like it was a low-level campaign that grew until I finally went to kind of the controller of the whole of local radio directly. Wow. And he was great. He was receptive, but he needed a bit of convincing. And then he like really generously gave me 3 months out my normal job to like really research podcasting and try out some pilots about how it could sound. And and that was the result. And I kind of presented that, and then I think I had a couple of months back in my normal job, and then they were like, go for it, let's try it for a year. And then I haven't gone back, and it's become my full-time job. So
amazing.
Yeah, it was.
And is it Multi-Story that's your full-time job, or are you working on other podcasts?
So Multi-Story was my full-time job in terms of output, but also part of my job is looking for other opportunities to develop podcasts in local radio. Then coronavirus came about, and I suddenly switched from working on the 4 series to launching a new podcast called Make a Difference, which isn't hugely dissimilar in the fact that I'm collecting stories from across all the stations again, but it's not theme-based. It's very like, this is what's happened this week. So local radio as a whole has this service called Make a Difference, which is very in the community. So essentially they have people manning phone lines and emails, and it's like, if you need help in whatever way or support, then you can ring this line or get in touch, and we can put you in touch with an individual or an organization that can help you. And as a result of this, obviously incredible stories were coming out of it, because someone would ring up and, the stories were, some of them are, they're quite distressing. Some of them, it's like, I cannot get food. Some of them are simply like, I feel lonely. And then someone will ring up the station and say, well, I'm happy to ring you. And so we started to get these beautiful stories coming out really early. So I think I got a call from the head of radio in England saying, I think we should look at doing something with these stories. And then 4 days later, we launched Make a Difference. And originally we were doing 2 a week. So for the first 3 months, we did 2 episodes a week. And now it's gone down to 1 a week. And it's just reflecting the stories that are coming out of the station. So they're very similar in sound to Make a Difference, in the sense it's me presenting similar music style, but not quite as, they're very quick. The output's quite quick. So it's not quite as finessed, and it's very like a local radio product. But, there's some incredible stories there.
And is that like a direct kind of directly correlated to coronavirus because of coronavirus? Like, is it going to continue on after? Because this seems like the Make a Difference initiative seems like it's been a long-standing thing. It's not just because of coronavirus, or maybe I misunderstood.
No, so it did launch as a result of. So it's interesting because Make a Difference as a brand started when lockdown came in the UK in March.
Oh, okay.
But it essentially is a reflection on what local radio has always done. We've always been in our communities. We've always, been connecting people and helping people. So I think it will continue. What's interesting in the podcast is very early on, it was very about food parcels and about NHS workers. So as the podcast has been going on, it's kind of the themes have changed. And so now I've started featuring on it stories that aren't directly linked to the pandemic. I mean, because they're happening in this time, they kind of are, but some of them, it's just nice people doing nice things. That's kind of, it's like good news stories, good deeds, that kind of thing.
There's a podcast that sounds very similar to your show called Kind World. It's based out of Boston. It's a Boston NPR station, and they feature similar stories. It's not necessarily in the same sort of format, and that there's no like call center or anything like that, but they just seek out these stories of people helping each other or things that people have done for each other. And, they're feel good stories for sure. And they're just nice things people have done for each other. So usually there's the sad part in the beginning and then the happy part at the end, which is kind of how it's, that's
I mean, I get messages from people with Multi-Story too a lot, where people say, you've made me cry on public transport. And it's like, I'm really sorry. Was it because you were sad or because you were happy? But yeah, it's been an actually interesting challenge doing Make a Difference because, there's no denying this is a really challenging year. And a lot of pretty much all the good news stories only exist because they come out of a place of, desperation or sadness. So it's an interesting balancing act to, make it so it's a podcast where people want to listen and they feel happy, but it's not completely removed from reality where I'm just pretending like everything's okay. And, you know, it's been interesting with multi-story. I try and inject myself into it as part of the podcast. You know, because I guess, you know, a lot of the way I make podcasts is the stuff I like to listen to, and I like hearing hosts inject a bit of their own self into it. With Make a Difference, that's been more challenging, and I've taken more of a backseat because, you know, you're constantly aware that I'm living a particular experience of this, and in some ways quite a privileged one. You know, I live in a house, you know, with a caring partner, and, you know, I have a job. And that's not the reality for a lot of people. So it's been an interesting one for me, balancing that. But, you know, I think Multi-Story is much more of a podcast. Make a Difference is a podcast, but it's also been being played on the radio station. So it's also been a radio show. It's gone back onto the station. So it is different. And it's almost in some ways more of a radio show first and a podcast second. But available in both formats.
Very cool. So let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk specifically about the playlist, about the episode that we featured of yours, and about the conversation around generations that we had. I mean, I know that the Eastman Lens chapter just met, I think yesterday, you said, right? And so I'm wondering if there's any like key takeaways from that meeting that you want to share.
I mean, I think everyone was really engaged. We actually had a good turnout, our pre-Christmas turnout, and there seemed to be themes that we picked up. Unsurprisingly, we started with multi-story as kind of a starting point. I kind of started the session by pointing out all the things that I thought were wrong with it and how I would edit it differently now. Like I had to get it out of my system. Like it's like a really awful thing that I think any like program makers do. Like, I'm so sorry, guys, that you had to listen to that because I noticed that like 4 minutes in, the levels were really bad. And also, I really wish I'd used a different music. They're just like, we don't
And
care.
I'm sure everybody was like, we did not notice at all. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like the equivalent of if you have a spot and you have to tell people that you know you have a spot on your face and no one cares.
Right, nobody cares.
No one cares. So, you know, I suppose there's quite a spread and it kind of fitted into a lot of the other conversations that were there. So, for example, the story of Eve talking to Jasper, and Eve being, she's now much older lady. She doesn't specify her age, but came over to the UK as part of the kinder transport before World War II. And that was quite interesting because it linked in with some of the other podcasts, which was about, you know, immigration and identity and conflict in culture. And that was quite interesting because a couple of our members, their parents came over to the UK from other countries. So that opened up a really interesting conversation where they could see some real parallels that were interesting there. And that actually fed into other things too. So talking about homosexuality and how that was viewed, which was a thing that came up in Multi-Story, but of course, one of the other podcasts too. And just about how difference of culture, but also of generation impact that.
Yeah. You know, what's funny is that, not funny, interesting. I actually sent Multi-Story to my mom, who is, as we were discussing right before we started recording, born and raised in England. She was born in Liverpool. My family, her side of the family still lives there. And one of her very, very good friends from childhood came over to the UK on the kinder transport as well. So, so we have, a link to that sort of, I had heard about the kinder transport, even though it's very much a UK thing and, you know, I don't think it's very well known in the United States, but because my mom has this link to a woman, a very good friend who came over. And I think she may have even gone to the ceremony that I think was mentioned in the episode with Sir Newton.
Yes.
What was his name?
You put me on the spot now. Let me think. What's his name? Sir Nicholas Winton.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there was a sort of personal, thread in that episode to my family. So it was really, really nice. And my mom listened and she loved it.
That's amazing. Well, I really recommend, there's this incredible video of, if you search Nicholas Winton on YouTube, it will come up. But there's this incredible video where he was invited onto this TV show that doesn't exist in the UK anymore. And he was just sitting in the audience, and he didn't realize that the whole audience was full of children that he'd saved who wouldn't be alive because of him. I mean, I kind of don't want to ruin it, but it's incredibly emotional. And
wow.
And like multi-story is brilliant for, you know, working on these programs, for opening me up to stories that I didn't fully understand. Like, you know, as kids in the UK, we're often taught about you know, children leaving London, evacuees leaving London to go to the countryside. But, you know, I didn't honestly fully know the kinder transport story. So often I do deep dives into stuff and, you know, come out learning a lot more. But really interesting. And, you know, we talked a lot about parallels about immigration coming into the UK now, and how people might be perceived differently, and, you know, child immigration and that kind of thing. So that opened up a really rich story, which, you know, quite a few of the podcasts on this playlist fed into.
Yeah. I mean, so I want to ask you a little bit about like why you think it's important to have intergenerational conversations, and not just that, but a little deeper than that, but also recording those conversations. Yeah.
So, I mean, at the beginning of this Generations multi-story episode, I think I did a little bit of a monologue on, you know, regretting not talking to more people. And, you know, I play a little bit of my great auntie Iris on there. And I'm so pleased that I have that, but I literally have a minute and a half. Like, I did that for a work piece, and it was uploaded onto the BBC website. In fact, I had to rip that off the BBC website and find a really old browser that would be compatible. And it's kind of sad that I didn't keep it. And I think, I don't know, it's often a regret when you look back. And now I think in audio a lot more now as well. It's almost like you look back and you regret not recording stuff. So I want to make sure I record my parents and record interviews with them, because, you know, you have these stories that they tell, and like I get a surface level understanding of it, but I actually want to go really in depth and understand them. And then you think, well, why not record them? Because it would be nice to listen back and tell stories further. You know, I spend a lot of my life listening to other people's recordings or recording complete strangers, and like, why do we not turn them on, you know, our direct family? Right. And I think also part of that is, as a kid, you just see your mum as your mum, or your grandpa as your grandpa.
Right. And nothing special. Right.
Well, yeah. And now I think, gosh, you know, like, I was really lucky to know all four of my grandparents, but, you know, sadly they've all now passed away. And there's actually stuff I think, I kind of know some stories, but not fully. And like, you know, the stories I want to ask my granddad about, you know, working in the factory he worked in, and stuff with my grandpa about like working in the shop he worked in, and, you know, war experiences. And I won't get to do that now, but how amazing if I had have done that.
Yeah. I mean, I feel the same way. And I think part of it is also, like, we can talk about generations, right? Or not just generations, but just growing up, right? Like, as young people, we just don't, like, you sort of realize the importance of it as you grow older. And just by virtue of everybody growing older, the likelihood you're going to be able to talk to those people, you know, diminishes every year, right? So as I age a year, my grandparents age a year. And as I age 10 years, my grandparents age 10 years. And so, and then in that 10 years, they may pass. And I think it's just one of those things that I think we realize maybe once we're a little bit older, and sometimes it's harder at that point to do those things. I will say that I also did start recording my parents right before the pandemic hit. I had been wanting to do this for a while, you know, just capturing family lore almost in this way that, like, we have all these crazy family stories, you know, of things that happened, and with different people in the family, but even like a generation or two before, you know. And to me, it's sort of like, I don't really care whether or not they're true or not. Like, they're still part of the family lore, you know, like somebody got on the wrong boat and ended up in Panama from, you know, they thought they were going to the United States and they ended up in Panama, and we still have a whole part of our family that's in Panama, you know? And so I think it's just fun to kind of, think about it. And if you have the opportunity, because I mean, think about how many pictures we take, right? And that's sort of our definition of recording, right? But we're not recording voices or stories in that same way. And so I think there is something maybe with the proliferation of podcasts and people getting more comfortable with the idea of voice only, maybe it will happen. We have here, I don't know if you've ever heard of, and I've mentioned this on the podcast just recently, StoryCorps. Have you ever heard of StoryCorps?
Yeah, I have heard of StoryCorps. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like they have these recording studios for people to just sit down with one other person and just have a conversation, and they record it. And then they pull out some of these conversations for a podcast or a radio program. But they also archive all of the stories at the Library of Congress, the United States Library of Congress. So it's sort of like an oral history.
Yeah. So there's a similar thing that's done with BBC Local Radio, BBC Radio 4, and the British Library. It's called the Listening Project. So they do a similar thing where they have a booth and it goes around the UK, and you can go and record in it. And yeah, they save the stuff in the British Library, and then some of it makes it onto local radio and some of it makes it onto Radio 4. And it's great. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think they've slightly changed it recently. So they're actually putting together strangers. So they try and pull together people who've not had a conversation before to open up about their own lives and explore the contrasts and the similarities. But yeah, I think it's great. And I guess it will be a New Year's resolution, I suppose, a post-pandemic resolution to do more of that. But I think, what's come clear with all of these stories is, obviously, we think about recording it and that's great, but sometimes it's literally just having those conversations that's so important. And, there's conversations I've had with people or moments of revelation that like massively stand out to me. And, again, in Multi-Story, I bring up one of them in that episode where before the story where there's the two gay guys, talking about their own experiences. And before I told a story about going to an older friend's civil partnership and him, talking about in the speech that, he never dreamed that he'd be able to do that because it was illegal in the UK when he was a teenager. And, that is a conversation I never had with him. I kind of guess I'm ashamed to say it's a conversation I never thought to have with him because you just, I'm not a person, I've not had that same life experience. And it's always stood out to me and I think about it a lot. And, when I made that episode, I did speak to him and I did ask, could we have an interview? Could I interview you and feature you? And he didn't feel comfortable with it even then, which I think is really telling. And it just shows that some things have changed and some haven't. He was happy for me to feature the story. In an anecdotal way, but and I think that came out in a number of the podcasts that actually sometimes things haven't changed that much and some things do continue throughout the generations, and sometimes that's quite comforting that actually we're all just people, and sometimes it's kind of sad when it's like a society thing or a block or something that actually it's an issue that continues.
So real quick, I just want to take a second to talk to anyone out there who's even thinking about starting a podcast. I use Podbean as my podcast host, and they have been fantastic. They have amazing technical support and lots of different options for hosting, including a free plan. The one I use is only $9 a month and has unlimited storage. They also have an ad marketplace that any Podbean show can join, and it helps you find advertisers for your show. To get a free month of hosting, go to podbean.com/PBC. But even if you don't host your show on Podbean, but you want to use their ad marketplace to place ads in other people's shows, you can sign up at sponsorship.podbean.com/PBC to get a $100 credit toward podcast advertising. Let's start wrapping up. But before we do, I always ask the guests if they have a podcast pick. So
this is difficult because usually I like trying to listen to loads of new podcasts, but I found like during the pandemic, I've kind of gone back to old favorites. It's kind of like a comforting thing.
I could see that.
Yeah. And I've been mainly getting a lot out of conversation, like deep conversation podcasts. So one thing that was new was Louis Theroux, who I love for his documentaries. He started a podcast where he's just interviewing interesting people. So I've loved that. But also I've gone back to Adam Buxton and listened to a lot of him. So he has a podcast and they actually went to school together, which is funny. So they've got a bit of cross-pollination in the podcast space. But he's had some really interesting interviews recently. It's always so hard to know how it travels because I think, he's an international, I don't know how popular he is elsewhere.
I have not heard. No, I don't know either of them. So wait, so are the names of the podcasts the names of the people or do they have?
Yeah, so Louis Theroux's one is called, so Louis Theroux is he's like a big documentary maker in the UK and he's always done filmmaking and he does documentaries. Funnily enough, he mainly does them in America. So he kind of started his career.
It's just possible. America. I'm very, very ignorant when it comes to like the names of people behind the scenes in movies and stuff. I barely ever know people's names.
Well, you may not know. He just might not be big in America. This is the thing. You just assume he is. So he does like documentaries where he'll like go and spend loads of time with people, and he often does it with quite like it's eccentric, like people who are kind of on the edge of different societies.
Okay,
he did a big film with the Scientologists. He does stuff with mental health, but he's not moved into the podcasting space. So he's done that. He's very much BBC person. So he's done one of those for the BBC and he's spoken to people he finds interesting. And then Adam Buxton is had a long, he's really established podcaster in the UK and he does really long interviews. He calls them ramble chats. They're quite different to normal interviews in the fact that they start on a point and they'll just go off literally on a ramble and just talk about whatever. So you actually hear from some quite big name people having conversations you never normally would. So that's been good. And his most recent one was with Paul McCartney from the Beatles. Oh, cool. So it's kind of quite a big name.
Yeah.
And for anyone who listens to Adam Buxton normally, it's interesting hearing his presenting style because he almost sounds a bit nervous and he's not quite as eccentric as he normally is because it's almost like he's aware he has like this bigger international audience. But, I really like his interviews because they're very, he's a bit eccentric and because he's not following a normal kind of interview kind of stream, I guess. They just go meander all over the place. It comes out with some really interesting things that you just wouldn't expect to hear. It'd be interesting for international listeners because, sometimes I listen to some big American podcast hosts and I have no idea who the people are, but I'm sure they're like big names there.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the people, I could probably say some of the people that Adam Buxton's interviewed recently and you'd think, who the hell is that?
Maybe.
Yeah.
So I just looked it up and the Adam Buxton podcast is called the Adam Buxton podcast, but the Louis Theroux one is called Grounded with Louis Theroux.
Yes. So it's grounded because he's stuck at home and normally he'd be making
see.
Yeah. Be out and about.
See, isn't that interesting? People are starting to do podcasts as their coronavirus projects. And then as soon as coronavirus is over, they might stop doing their podcast, Well,
yeah, I know. But it's interesting because I think Louis Theroux's podcast has been one of the biggest for the BBC this year because, in the UK, he's a big name and people love what he does.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know if he'll carry on or not. It might be a bit of a shame. I mean, because him and Adam Buxton went to school together, there's quite a lot of joking about him moving into Adam's space and he should back to telly. And the fact that Adam sent him his microphone so he could record and he's just not returned it. So, I mean, it's all very niche, but this is the great thing about podcasting, right? It's like a community and like all of this to people who've never listened, you'll be thinking, I don't know if I like this. But to me, I'm living off the kind of battle between them.
But then at the same time, like it's because it's so niche, when you find the other people that also listen to that same podcast, there's like this instant bond, this instant like connection that you have. Like if you talk to me right now and I was like, oh my God, I love the Adam Buxton podcast, like there would be this instant like conversation that would happen. And that's what I love about podcasts.
Yeah. 100%. And like the thing as well about Adam Buxton is it's such a podcasting podcast too, because he does he makes all of his own ads, like he voices his own ads, but they'll be So he does one at the moment for Squarespace where he basically completely rips off Ira Glass. And it's it's kind of like a loving representation where he's also like really just taking the mick out of like a very American style. And it just makes you laugh a lot, and it's very clever, but it's like very knowing. So if you like into podcasting, you'll get what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Well, I will add those to the show notes. So last question, just how can people follow you? How can people, find out more about Multistory?
So you can find out by Multistory it's on the BBC website, although I don't think it's available internationally. But if you're in the UK, as a BBC employee, I should encourage you to download the BBC Sounds app. Mm-hmm. But you can get it on other places. And so it's Multistory. And you can find me on Twitter. So we don't actually have a podcast social media. It's kind of just an all BBC one, but you can find me at Becca Bryers, and I'm often talking about it, and make a difference in the same place. But it's pretty searchable. I feel like everyone just uses their search engine of choice, right?
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure. And thank you for all that you do for podcasts in the world and for Podcast Brunch Club.
Thank you. It's been great being on here. And, I get so much love from, talking about community. Podcast Brunch Club has created a new community for me of people that live in my area who I would never have met, but now are my friends. So thank you to you as well for setting all of that up. It's lovely to be part of a wider podcasting community, an international podcasting community.
That means so much to me. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening and being a part of the Podcast Brunch Club community. Do you have any thoughts on our discussion this month? Send a message or voice memo to podcast@podcastbrunchclub.com. PBC is a passion project, and we rely on support from our global community to continue bringing people together in person and online. So if you feel like PBC has contributed to your life in any way, please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Go to podcastbrunchclub.com/support for more information. If you're interested in becoming an organizational partner, go to podcastbrunchclub.com/sponsors. A quick thanks to our early partners, Podbean. For one free month of podcast hosting, go to podbean.com/PBC. Podchaser, the IMDb of podcasts. Listen Notes, a podcast search engine. Critical Frequency, the podcast network for everyone else. The Venn Media, a weekly newsletter for curious minds. And Lentigua Williams & Company, podcast network, telling stories in the seams of society. Finally, some credits for this episode. Katie DeFiore is our audio editor. Music is from Chad Crouch and Misael Gauna, downloaded from Free Music Archive. I'm Adela, founder of Podcast Brunch Club, and as always, thanks and happy listening.